What developments in the Islamic conception of history came after the Quran? What did the seal of the prophets come to mean, and why? How did the Seljuks and the Franks change Islamic conceptions of history? Describe the rise of the Mongols in the Islamic world. What were the effects of the Mongols' arrival? Last time, we took a look at the Quran's vision of history and noticed that history begins and ends in timeless states of creation at the beginning and judgment at the end. Between the dawn and the dusk of this time was a repeating wheel of prophetic history. People were sinful and corrupt. God would send a prophet. The prophet would be assaulted and mocked, and then God would destroy the evildoers. And this pattern would continue on for all time. As long as humans were forgetful, that is, as long as they were humans, they would require returned summonses to God, and most would not heed the call. Notice two things here. First, the Quran's vision of history doesn't have an immediate future. There's a past, a present, and a distant future at the end of time. But there's no concern with the near future, the time after Muhammad, but before the end of the world. Second, humans are not only judged in the Akhirah. God punishes and rewards humans based on their obedience and disobedience in this life. If people perish, then it must be due to their wickedness. If people thrive, it must be due to their virtues. So what does that mean for those Muslims who lived after Muhammad and the Sahaba? They didn't fail, they succeeded. Muhammad's opponents were defeated, and he died peacefully in his bed. Muhammad won. His Ummah won. And so, it makes sense that the early Muslims took this as a sign of God's blessing on this endeavor called Islam. If Islam was thriving, and even spread, it must be because God had approved of the Muslims themselves. God loved the Muslims, and so the Muslim empires were prospering. And because the Muslim empires were prospering, it proved that God loved them. And so it seems that the pattern of history laid out in the Quran was broken. The prophets had always been oppressed by their people and were rejected. This defined human history itself. But Muhammad conquered his enemies in the end. Before Muhammad, the past prophets and their believers were caught in a whirlpool of defeat. After Muhammad, something about the nature of history itself had changed. The first evidence that we see of this in the historical record is the Taqwim al-Hijri, the Hijri calendar, or the Islamic lunar calendar. That is, Muslims had literally reordered the calculation of time. And they specifically had reordered it in order to account for the foundation of their community. The Hijri or Islamic calendar doesn't begin with the birth of Muhammad, or with his death, or with the first revelation of the Quran, but instead with the Hijra, the migration of Muhammad and his people to Medina, when the Ummah began. That is the Gregorian year 622, which is Hijri year 1. The early Muslims certainly must have seen some kind of major historical change around them, major enough to turn the year clock back to 1. Also, the way Muslims discussed Muhammad and his role changed quite a bit. While the Quran doesn't dwell much on Muhammad as a person, nor on the immediate future, and not on what happens to prophets if they actually succeed. The first literatures about Muhammad, the Sirah and the Hadith, are much more Muhammad-centric. Muhammad wasn't just one more prophet in the series. He was the culmination of all prophets, the greatest prophet, the prophet foreseen and foretold by all the others. History awaited the coming of Prophet Muhammad. When Muhammad, the messenger of God, reached the age of 40, God sent him in compassion to humankind as a messenger to all people. God made a covenant with every prophet whom he had sent before Muhammad, that each prophet should believe in him, testify to his truth, and help him against his enemies. He demanded of them that they should relay this to everyone who believed in them. They fulfilled their obligations in this. All the prophets pointed to Muhammad. He was sent not just to one people like the prophets in the past. He was sent to all people everywhere. The strongest evidence of this change from the Quran's vision of a static human history to the later Muslims' vision of a triumphant history was this closing of the line of prophets, the belief that Muhammad was the last prophet. Consider this verse of the Quran. Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, but the messenger of God and the seal of the prophets. God has knowledge of everything. This expression, the seal of the prophets, the Khatam al-Nabiyyin, only occurs once in the Quran, and it most immediately refers to Muhammad's role as the proof of the former prophets in the past. The Quran dozens of times says that God strikes examples, mathals, for the human race, a phrasing that suggests God makes ayat and parables like a goldsmith strikes coins, using an inverse seal to imprint an image. Muhammad, in this case, is the image of the former prophets in the present, and they validate his prophecy in turn. That is, calling Muhammad the seal of the prophets means that he's just like the other prophets. He is literally the image of them. But at some point, perhaps in Muhammad's own lifetime, the phrase seal of the prophets started to signify that Muhammad was not like the other prophets. It began to get understood as the one who seals prophecy closed, the last prophet. There would be no more prophets after him. God had successfully contacted the entire human race, and no more prophets would ever come, as nearly all Muslims across history would affirm. Muhammad is the last and greatest prophet. And therefore, that old story in the Quran had come to an end. Before Muhammad, God sent prophet after prophet in mixed efforts to save people from themselves. But that task was over after Muhammad, and therefore the pattern of history shifted radically from a cycle of persecuted prophets to the victory of Muhammad and the ascent of Islam. And history validated all of this. A minor player called Muhammad from the middle of nowhere had consolidated the bickering tribes of the Jahiliyyah into a unified ummah. Within a generation, the Rashidun caliphs controlled all of Arabia and the Levant. Within a century, the Umayyad caliphs ruled an empire reaching from Spain to India. And within 3 centuries of Muhammad, the Abbasid caliphs controlled the wealthiest, most educated, most technologically advanced civilization that had ever been. Ancient history was marked by God's displeasure with belief. But Islamic history was marked by God's fondness for the believers. But the celebration of Islam's ascent didn't last forever. If you tie your sense of history and purpose into material success, sooner or later reality will step in to correct you. This already started with the Seljuks. Suddenly the Arabs and the Persians were subservient to the Seljuk Turks, the sultans, the real power of the empire. By the end of the Abbasid period in 1258, the caliph had little power beyond the doors of his own palace. The vicegerent of God on earth, the caliph, the representative of the Prophet Muhammad and the commander of the faithful, was just a puppet. And this didn't go unnoticed. The Seljuks set off another chain of events with their arrival as well. Remember when the Seljuks first swept into the Abbasid Empire, they were also fighting with the Byzantine Romans? The place that the Seljuk Turks invaded was the region of Anatolia. And they invaded it so well that it's still to this day called the Land of the Turks, Turkiye, Turkey. Well, this was Roman land before, and the vestiges of the Roman Empire weren't crazy about all these tribal peoples arriving in their lands en masse. Most notably was Pope Urban II over in Rome. The Latin Western Christians had just broken with the Eastern Greek Christians in 1054. This event was called the Great Schism. Well, now, in 1095, just 41 years later, Pope Urban took this Turkish incursion as a way to reopen his communion with the Eastern Greek Christians, and also to consolidate his own power in the Latin West. Pope Urban was one of the Franks, the proto-French people, and so, in his own lands, and to his own people, the Pope called for a war not to take Anatolia, but to take Jerusalem. Now, just so you know, Jerusalem wasn't taken by the Seljuks, or even by the Abbasids, or even by the Umayyads before them. Jerusalem wasn't really taken at all. Jerusalem had been signed over in a land deal between the local Christian patriarch Sophronius and the Rashidun Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab in the year 638. So, the Christian Holy Land, and the city of Jerusalem specifically, had absolutely nothing to do with the arrival of the Seljuks, their conflicts with the Byzantines, or the schism between the Eastern and Western Christians. Neither the Seljuks nor the Abbasids took it from anyone. Jerusalem had been in the hand of Islamic rulers for over 400 years by this point. The Abbasids and the Seljuks inherited it from the Umayyads, who had inherited it from the Rashidun caliphs, who had obtained it peacefully. But Urban II didn't see it that way. He assumed, we have to guess, that these Seljuk Turks, who had been troubling the Eastern Christians, were the same people who had taken control of Jerusalem 4 centuries earlier. And so, Urban II called for a Frankish military expedition to take Jerusalem, even though it had never been held before by the Franks or by the popes. Urban is reported to have said, "News that the people of the Persian kingdom, an alien people, a race completely foreign to God, has invaded Christian territory and has devastated this territory with pillage, fire, and the sword. Jerusalem is the navel of the world, a land which is more fruitful than any other, a land which is like another paradise of delights. This royal city, situated in the middle of the world, is now held captive by his enemies and is made a servant by those who know not God for the ceremonies of the heathen. It looks and hopes for freedom. It begs unceasingly that you will come to its aid. It looks for help from you, especially because, as we have said, God has bestowed glory and arms upon you more than any other nation." Notice that Urban knows nothing about the history of Jerusalem. He even incorrectly thinks that these Seljuk invaders are Persians. But 4 years later, in 1099, the first Frankish forces arrived at the gates of Jerusalem. And the local population of Arabic-speaking Christians, Jews, and Muslims were, shall we say, surprised. Who were these Al-Ifranij Franks, who spoke strange languages and came from the edges of the known world, killing everyone in their path. The people of Jerusalem would have probably heard about this wandering horde from the west, who tried to kill all the Jews in their own country, had sacked both Christian and Muslim cities in the Byzantine and Abbasid empires, and had occasionally turned to cannibalism. Why were they wearing heavy suits of armor in the Levantine sun? Why did they claim authority over the Levant when they clearly had nothing to do with the place? They had never lived here. Their ancestors had never lived here. They didn't speak the language or know the culture. And yet, here they are, sieging the walls of Jerusalem. And when the city fell, the Franks put most of the population to the sword. Although most of the locals fled for their lives, the Jerusalemite Jews were locked in their synagogue, which was then set on fire. Muslims fled into Al-Aqsa Mosque at the city's high point, where the invaders slaughtered them all. Christians of various sects were cut down in the streets. By the end of the siege, the Frankish horses were tripping and slipping from all of the bodies and all of the blood. From the point of view of the Muslims, and for that matter of the Eastern Christians and Jews, these Franks were tribal barbarians from nowhere who arrived suddenly, randomly, and claimed land to which they had no rights, and then killed indiscriminately. This was shocking, to be sure. These unwashed, uncultured Franks had bested the people blessed by God. Certainly, the Seljuks and the Abbasids were not as powerful as they seemed to be, and maybe God didn't love them as much as they thought. The response to this Frankish invasion would not come from Baghdad, but from Egypt. Over in Egypt at this time, there had been a rival caliphate to the Abbasids called the Fatimids. Founded in what is now Tunisia in 909, the Fatimid caliphs had invaded Egypt in the year 969. But by the time of the Frankish arrival in Jerusalem a century later, the Fatimids had been in decline. A Kurdish general in the Fatimid army, who was also one of the Fatimids' viziers, was named Yusuf ibn Ayyub. He claimed power for himself and abolished this rival caliphate in the year 1171. He declared himself the first Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt, and he allied himself with the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. Then, with this reformed Islamic Egypt and with the aid of the Abbasid Empire, Yusuf ibn Ayyub sought to repel the Frankish and other Western European forces from the Middle East in 1182, finally taking Jerusalem in 1187. This triumph against the Franks earned Yusuf ibn Ayyub the title of Salah ad-Din, the one righteous in the religion, or, as we call him in English, Saladin. While Frankish, Papal, and other Western European forces would, over the next 2 centuries, try to retake the eastern lands of the Mediterranean, Jerusalem most especially, they would never meaningfully hold it again. This period, which in the 1760s was dubbed the Crusades, or the Wars of the Cross, would mark a turning point for the Western Europeans, where they would, for the first time since the ancient Romans, move onto the world stage. Just a few things, though. While people still today will invoke the notion of crusade as a war between Christians and Muslims, it was anything but. The Crusaders themselves didn't even have a notion of crusade, and many of the Crusades were against other Christians, such as the Fourth Crusade, which tried to take Constantinople from the Byzantine Christians, or the Albigensian Crusade, which tried to wipe out the Cathar Christian movement in France. Furthermore, these so-called Crusades made little impact on the Islamic world that the Western Christians were trying to invade. However, they did expose a flaw in Islamic triumphalism. These people with very little technological, military, or cultural prowess had, at least in the short term, successfully invaded part of the caliph's own domain. The Islamic Empire was not foolproof, for these barbarian tribes rode out of nowhere and caused decades of headaches. But The groups we call the Crusaders would, in reality, be completely overshadowed in Islamic history by another group of invaders who arrived 2 generations later. Not from the West, but from the East. The Crusades would prove a major turning point in the history of Western Christians. But for the peoples of the Middle East, these attacks on the shores of the Mediterranean were more insults than injuries. Indeed, the Crusades left almost no lasting mark on Middle Eastern culture, Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. But a new kind of invaders would. In fact, these new invaders, the Mongols, would end the Abbasid, Seljuk, and Ayyubid periods and transform the Islamic world forever. The people now called the Mongols, or the Tartars, were the tribes of northeastern Central Asia, the Mongol steppe. They were famed horse masters and riders. There are stories of Mongols learning to ride before they learned how to walk. But they had little to do with the world beyond their tribal lands. Each tribe lived under a chieftain, a Khan. They lived by plundering, as many tribal nomadic peoples do. And they mostly fought with each other and raided their neighbors on and off as the centuries rolled by. But in the early 13th century, rumbles and rumors started coming from the east of a Khan named Temujin. Temujin and his Mongols moved fast, traveled light, and lived rough. Somehow, we're not exactly sure, he started defeating rival Khans and combining their tribes into a kind of super tribe. And the larger Temujin's super tribe became, the more they had to plunder to survive. More people mean more mouths, and more mouths mean more plunder. While that meant more wealth for Temujin Khan and his subordinates, it also meant more work and more loss of life for their cavalry. So, Temujin came up with a fearful solution. He would spare his men and much of their work by inspiring terror. You make people so afraid of you that they just hand over their lands and wealth. If they resisted, you would kill them and take what you wanted anyway. And then word would spread of how dangerous you were, prompting future victims to surrender more quickly. They would know what happened to those who defied the Mongol Khan. By the end of his life, Temujin's reign of terror would catapult him into a position where he ruled over hundreds of cities, nations, and tribes. He would be called the Khan with the power as wide as the ocean, Chinggis Khan, or Genghis Khan. Maybe the first historical ruler that we can truly call genocidal. Chinggis Khan was also remarkably innovative. He transformed the hunting techniques that his people had perfected into military movements, such as his famous pincer attack and the use of the false retreat. He used the Mongol nomadic culture to his advantage too. He kept his people on the move and didn't let them settle down. The 20th century concept of the Lightning War, or the Blitzkrieg, was named after the Mongol strategy of striking heavy, fast, and hard. The Mongolian word for a garrison, an orda, is where we get the notion of a horde, an overwhelming force. And Genghis Khan standardized his people's measures and weapons. If any Mongol picked up any Mongol arrow, it would always fit his bow. And to keep his new empire in place, rather than just passing his holdings on to his oldest son, Ogadai, Chinggis divided his newborn empire into parts, each one under one of his sons or grandsons, who would each be a Khan in turn. The title of Khan would always be passed on to Chinggis Khan's descendants, who split his land in a number of ways. And together, they would hold the largest empire of the pre-modern world. One line of descent took China and Korea, establishing the Yinchao, the Huan dynasty under Kublai Khan. Another line took what is now Russia under the Ultan Ord, the Khanate of the Golden Horde. Chinggis Khan's second son, Chagatai, took Central Asia into the Chagatai Khanate. And, most important to our ends here, Chinggis's grandson, Hulagu Khan, founded the Ilkhanate, which would encompass Persia and later most of the northern Arab lands too. Hulagu Khan, like all of the other early Khans, kept his grandfather's battle plans in check. You would attack quickly and hit hard, killing and destroying as much as you can, men, women, and children. The worse your reputation became, the easier it would be at the next city, and to take the one after that, and to take the one after that. And if any city didn't take your threat seriously, they were to be made an example of, as brutally as possible. One by one, the great cities of the Abbasid Empire started to surrender or face the consequences. Once massive cities like Merv, Samarkand, Balkh, and Nishapur were nearly annihilated in their failed attempts to resist the Mongols. The death tolls were astronomical, in the millions. The people of Baghdad learned what was coming for them. The Abbasid Caliph, Al-Mutasim, didn't want to give in to their threats, and so he waved off Hulagu's demand for Baghdad's surrender. But the rest of the people of the City of Peace weren't so confident. As Hulagu's horde surrounded the city on the outside in January of 1258, Baghdad on the inside was torn into infighting and rioting, just as Hulagu had planned it. The Mongol strategy of weakening their enemies with terror in advance of their arrival worked very well. Then, an advisor to the Caliph turned tail, and the Caliph's army broke ranks after him. The Mongols, not wanting an army on the loose, attacked the Caliph's troops from their rear while they fled, shooting those in the back with arrows, as those in the front were crushed or drowned as the Mongols led them like a band of animals into the Tigris River. Without a standing army left to guard the city, the Mongols broke through and over the walls of Baghdad on the 29th of January, 1258. Al-Mutasim was trapped in his palace, and he finally offered surrender, but it was too late. The Mongols had been resisted, and so the Baghdadis needed to be made an example of. The people of Baghdad, along with their history, their city, and their culture, would need to be wiped off the face of the earth. The plundering of the City of Peace lasted for over 2 weeks. All 39 public libraries, including the fabled House of Wisdom, were destroyed. All of the scholars and scribes were put to the sword. All of the books were thrown into the river until it ran black with ink for over a year. Every mosque, church, and hospital was deliberately burned to the ground. The city's noble families, the 3,000 or so houses that controlled the Abbasid Empire, each had to beg in turn for their lives, and each in turn were publicly executed to the last child. Finally, Al-Mutasim, the Caliph himself, was brought out of his palace. All but one of his children were killed, and Hulagu, superstitious of spilling the blood of a caliph, had him wrapped in a carpet and trampled to death by horses. The city, home to over 1 million people, was nearly leveled. Nearly every other notable city in the Abbasid Empire, after hearing what became of the capital, surrendered to the Mongols immediately. The Abbasid age was over. Baghdad would be a ruin for the next 200 years. The aftermath of the Mongol invasions was cataclysmic in the Islamic world. One can almost sense a kind of collective Muslim depression during this period. The God of Islam seemed, if only for a moment, to have failed before the power of the Khans. But slowly, something else happened. Islam conquered the Mongols. Two of the Khanates, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Golden Horde in Russia, that is, half of the Mongol world, officially converted by the beginning of the 14th century. They started speaking Islamicate languages like Turkish, Arabic, and most especially Persian. And furthermore, having a single extended family of rulers from China to India to Persia to the edges of Europe meant that the fabled Silk Road, the movement of goods across Asia, worked faster and more efficiently than ever before. And in the end, the wealth, power, and success of the Mongols folded right back into the older Islamic conceptions of history. Of course they became Muslims. Why else would God have allowed them to topple the Abbasids? What developments in the Islamic conception of history came after the Quran? What did the seal of the prophets come to mean, and why? How did the Seljuks and the Franks change Islamic conceptions of history? Describe the rise of the Mongols in the Islamic world. What were the effects of the Mongols' arrival?